Forza Horizon by Playground Games. It's a series that just keeps getting better and better from one installment to the next. A franchise still some way off its peak, I'd say, and with Forza Horizon 5, we have a title that successfully straddles two console generations, delivering the goods even on the base Xbox One S, while providing a genuine technological leap when played on Xbox Series X hardware. Now, we covered the game extensively at launch, and we were able to do so thanks in part to Playground Games itself, who threw their doors open to Digital Foundry, going in depth on their aspirations for the game, the systems they developed to get the most out of cross-gen. And yeah, key staff agreed to be interviewed in order to better inform our coverage of the time. Now, this video has been a long time coming for various reasons, but we could finally share those interviews. And this is the story of Forza Horizon 5, as told by some of the people that made it. And yeah, the discussion begins by talking about the Forza Horizon 5 concept itself, principally the all-important choice of locale and the additional opportunities offered to the studio by virtue of delivering the game with a significantly longer development cycle.
We already knew that we were going to take 3 years rather than our regular 2-year cycle. 2 years would have aligned us pretty much on console launch day for the Xbox Series X and S. The challenges of hitting console launch date inside our typical 2-year dev cycle would have really impeded on our ambition. And that allowed us some other freedoms as well, such as our ambition is to create the largest Horizon game yet. Largest world, largest number of activities, largest car list, just the all-around biggest and best game we had yet produced. We start to look at countries that could accommodate that in an open world game, and it's basically the next thought is that, well, they also need to be incredibly diverse, because if it's just a large map and it's more of the same, then that isn't going to make a really compelling open world for players to explore. And so that becomes our next search criteria. We need a country that is huge and also offers incredible diversity. And that's where we discovered Mexico. And it's even before we've made that final decision. We're researching those countries and researching what they could offer us and what they can offer us creatively when we're building an open world, and what they can offer us in terms of beauty when you're trying to paint those beautiful landscapes and give players these really stunning locations that they can explore.
One of the things that we looked for when we're choosing a new location was just some new biomes that Forza Horizon player hasn't experienced yet. So like our living desert with all the cacti and kind of boulders lying about, as well as our swamp and our volcano region and our canyon region. Those are all new kind of experiences for the player.
And you know where this is going, right? With Forza Horizon 5, Playground settled on Mexico, the richest and most diverse location the studio had ever tackled.
When you start to look into Mexico, and it just has these incredible biome diversity, from towering volcanoes to pristine, like beautiful tropical beaches where you could just imagine spending your absolute dream holiday, into the jungle where it just feels like almost you're in another world. Obviously that's deserts. I think that's probably the first thing that people think of when they think of Mexico. But even within there, there's a sandy desert, which is probably what you'd imagine, but then there's also these living deserts which almost have as much plant life as a forest in terms of just variety of plants and density of them. They're not tall like a forest, but there's still so much in there that's actually just alive, and that when the rains fall, it's just they come into full bloom, and it's a desert, but it's also full of flowers and greenery. All that came together, and it just really sung to us as like the perfect location for a Horizon game.
Once we chose a location, we send a team over to Mexico, and we capture as much as we can. So a lot of reference for high-res photography. We capture things like roads, the foliage, geology, the skies. We have a new sky rig for this project as well. And we capture as much as we can. Videos as well, camera footage of people just driving down the roads.
Including one of them that we sent up a volcano.
Yeah. And we use all that, we bring it back, and we have all this information that we just kind of feed into back into the game. We reprocess all the scan data, all the photogrammetry, all the skies, and we recreate it basically, A and B, photo to photo of those specific areas. Everything is derived off of reference. So we take photographs of, say, a brick wall, probably 50 photos of that brick wall, and use it for photogrammetry and create a one-to-one texture from that scan. From then, an artist goes in and will kind of clean that up and make it usable for the game, so we can tile it and reuse it in different circumstances. Everything is heavily based on reference. Everything is measured. We try to take pictures of glancing angles to see how the light reflects off the surface as well. Actually, there's one other scan method that's new that we use for Forza Horizon 5, and that is vector scanning. So with a big focus on foliage for Forza Horizon 5, we implemented a new technique where we can actually sample leaves and take high-res scans in this kind of contraption that we've made in-house. I mean, it kicks out kind of high-res normal maps, high-res diffuse, high-res height maps as well. They did go several times to the different locations to capture the seasonal variances at the different biomes.
Had to capture the skies in different seasons as well, didn't we? And
yeah,
try to capture some stormy skies in the storm season, but where it wasn't in conditions that would actually destroy the camera rig. So a real balancing act.
So we've got some idea of the thinking behind how Playground chose Mexico and some of the research that went into capturing the essence of the various locations and bringing that home to Leamington Spa, UK, where Playground are based. And it's at that point that the tech team starts to get to grips with the challenge facing them.
So I think when we were first shown Mexico, and we looked at the density of geology that we had there, so the volcano and the coast and the living desert and all of the rocks and different formations that we had there, it was, I think everybody looked at the geology team and kind of said, oh, good luck with that. And I think the amount of resolution that we wanted to put in there and represent correctly for Mexico was very high. Then we moved to Guanajuato, and I think Guanajuato is a huge sprawling city with lots of variation, lots of unique buildings, as well as difficulty with lighting correctly going in and out of tunnels. And I think everybody looked at the kind of asset team and the building team and kind of patted them on their backs and said, yeah, good luck with that. And then we moved to the jungle, and yeah, everybody started just a gasp, I think, at the amount of density and foliage that actually occurs in the jungles and how we go about recreating that. And not only recreating that, but being able to be diverse and have one area where you drive out of a jungle and then 2 minutes later you are on a beach. And I think the variation that we have there means that we're having to attack it on a wide front. There's lots of different things that we need to investigate, but all of it is pushed to the next level. Like, all of it is more dense, all of it is higher resolution, all of it is more varied than we ever have done before. And then on top of that, designs say that they want to be dropped out of a plane on top of a volcano, which is now our highest point in any Forza Horizon game ever. And they want huge vistas across all of this landscape. So we want to be able to see multiple biomes at once, kilometers into the distance. And I think that, for me, was probably the biggest challenge in creating Mexico and making sure that each one of those biomes is staying authentic, representing the whole of Mexico.
It's a technological challenge for sure, but the culmination of this is put front and center right at the very beginning of the game. The signature Forza Horizon intro drive, meticulously planned out and scripted by Playground. It's not just a spectacular visual hit, it's a statement of intent from the developers on the kinds of experience the player can look forward to throughout the game, a teaser of sorts. So it's a big gameplay environment to explore, and one that's richer, more dense than any Horizon before. And this in itself presents challenges. How do you create a world that has such meticulous detail? Handcrafting it all from scratch isn't viable. Proceduralism, the notion of algorithmically generating or embellishing environments, is key.
So we use proceduralism in a number of places throughout our world, and it allows us to create the large expanses that you see. So we use it on the terrain, and this allows the artists to paint down height maps and 3D shapes that will then get changed into mesh. The procedural system also supports materials. So when we're painting down materials, we can paint down a number of different grass types, or we can paint down mud types, and it will blend them together as much as the artist wants them to. We can even do things like where we should add a higher parallax map versus a lower parallax map. All of these rules as well extend to allow placement of objects. So our foliage placement is all rule-based. So we might say, when you paint down a grass material, you're also placing down 3D elements of grass. Or when we're painting down a mud material or a undergrowth material, paint down 3D undergrowth objects as well, or little twigs or rocks. So the way that procedural comes in is it allows the artists to be artists and story tell. So instead of them having to place down 10,000 trees, they can now say, I want trees here, but I'm going to concentrate on this one little bit where I'm going to have a tree that's fallen over, and I'm going to tell a story around this tree now. And I'm going to put in some undergrowth that's been cut back, or maybe it's fallen across a path or something like that. Now, if you say to an artist, go place down 10,000 trees, they're not going to have time to go storytell and set dress and be artists. So the whole point in proceduralism, especially in the world, is allow artists to go be artists in those locations.
And capturing the essence of Mexico required an innovative approach to lighting and the introduction of an implementation of global illumination we hadn't seen in a Forza title before.
With Mexico skies specifically, we get these amazing sunsets and sunrises because of the high humidity and high fog. You know, during those low sun angles, you get really beautiful pink skies and purple skies. And yeah, that really kind of sets the tone for the game all up. And we've captured skies for every season. So we have different skies for every season, which really adds to that, you know, authenticity in the game. And yeah, that sky, all that physical based units that our skies are now kind of being driven from, yeah, they have the biggest effect on our world, and playing into our new Surfle GI system it just makes everything look just a lot more real and a lot more grounded than anything we've had before.
We rewrote our global illumination system for the ground up. So previously we'd used the voxel global illumination system, and we moved to a new Surfle-based global illumination system. So Surfles are data that we generate in the world based on placement of objects, their albedo color, and their normal direction. So we store that during a pre-processing pass, and then at runtime we take that Surfle data and we create a set of probes that we relight based on the dynamic global lighting conditions of the game. So that data is only created once, but can be updated for different times of day, different weather conditions, and different locations. So this Surfle-based system allowed us to improve the visual quality of our indirect illumination.
Obviously, we are changing our track constantly when we're in development, and having to go in and manually place all of those probes in the world, those 10 million probes in the world, isn't something that you want an artist to have to do, and then we change something and they have to go do it again. So we use a procedural placement system to place those probes in the world. We come up with a rule set that focuses the probes in areas of interest. So around the roads, we have more probes, and around any point of interest. So if there are buildings, if there are trees, if there are rocks, that's where there will be a higher proportion of probes in the world. These probes are placed in the world on a grid fashion around these objects, but then we relax the grid, because what we want to try and do is get these objects as close to changes in color and also occlusion as possible. So you want these probes right up next to buildings, or underneath foliage, as well as all the way up to the canopy of a foliage, as well as above the canopy of the foliage. What you're trying to do is get the biggest difference between where things are occluded and where color is changing. So you might have a probe that's at the base of a building, but you also want probes that come out from the building into the center of the road, because if you weren't, you wouldn't be able to capture that difference and that contrast between being in the center of the road or being next to the edge of the building. This procedural system also works with manually placed probes, and there are a few areas in the world where GI is very key. These are things like tunnel entrances. So we add to the system, and we add a few manual probes in those areas that get built into the GI system to make sure that those areas are as clean and as well represented in the probes as possible.
The concept of a cross-generation Forza Horizon opened up a lot of opportunities, because obviously with the power of Xbox Series X in particular, a much higher level of fidelity is possible. That said, all key systems are common across the entire stack of Xbox consoles. It's just that additional fidelity and rendering features are added to the higher-end machines.
So the GPU power available on the Series X really allowed us to push the visual quality, the fidelity, and the systems that we could write for that console. We approached that in the way that we didn't want to lose those systems entirely, so we still have them scaling back on layering platforms. But particularly the Surface GI system, so I mentioned about we have a quadrupling the resolution of that, which gives us much better fidelity for our indirect lighting, both in terms of our sky visibility and our indirect bounce. And some of the areas we also improve for the high end on Series X. So our volumetric lighting system runs at a higher resolution as well, and that one calculates our volumetric lighting in the scene from mediums such as dust and water droplets in the air. So that one runs at a higher resolution, and we calculate that on a compute shader. So it calculates the lighting for all of the textures in the 3D texture, and then we composite that into the scene and gives us a much more physically correct lighting system this time around.
When you look at the amount of different materials that you need on the buildings or the difference in foliage that you have there, not only are we looking at pushing that out further and being more accurate, but we're also trying to create the diversity of different materials and different textures in the world. And I think that that's something that really excels on the higher end platforms, because it does allow us to keep the same fidelity that we're also used to, but now we're able to have so much more diversity that there was no way that you'd ever be able to have that before at that fidelity.
And while 60 frames per second has been a welcome feature to many current gen games, fidelity costs, right? Now, you can play Forza Horizon 5 at 60 and it looks great, but to really see the engine pushed and to see the game at its absolute best, it's the 30 FPS fidelity mode that you need. It's the way that I play the game myself, and fundamentally it's one of the few titles where I think the trade of dropping to 30 does actually pay off.
That cinematic quality that you get, the motion blur is one part of it, but I think it's also pushing up the quality of all the things like the LOD transitions. It's really keeping the immersion for the player as high as possible, so you don't get anything that breaks the immersion. And so in the performance modes, we have to make some trade-offs based on the frame time for things like LOD quality and draw distance and so on, whereas in 30 modes we're completely unconstrained by that, and as Gareth mentioned, we can really push those out such that the player is fully immersed in the world. You don't notice any of those transitions. Again, those systems are all scaled to the max, and it's also a philosophy that we use for our high-end PC versions as well. So with the scalability that we add for those systems to run in quality mode, it means that we can also run those systems at high quality on PC when you've got the hardware that can handle it as well.
And while I suspect that Forza's support of hardware-accelerated ray tracing is in a kind of nascent form on Xbox Series consoles, it is there in Forza Horizon 5, just in a limited capacity.
We support ray tracing on both the Series S and Series X consoles, and we apply it in certain game modes. We use it for specular reflections, and that means that in these modes where you can really see the car in the full level of detail, including photo mode, you can get the most realistic visuals possible. So we trace all of the rays reflecting from off the car body that are hitting the car itself. So you get the reflections of wing mirrors, engines, particularly cars with reflective chrome parts, so we can improve the level of detail there.
And especially the cars that have open engines and lots of roll cages, all of those reflections now look perfectly correct.
So, how does scalability work on Forza Horizon 5 across the 4 different consoles? Comparing Xbox One S to Xbox Series X can show some vast differences, but ultimately, every Xbox player can play in the same game space. There's an immense number of variables Playground can tweak, additional layers of detail, extra rendering features, and as the detail stacks up, the requirements on the streaming systems exceed the mechanical hard drives of the last-gen machines. So, the harder Playground pushes, the more of the Xbox Series feature set comes into play.
Yeah, so one of the things that we wanted to concentrate on this time around with the extra power that was afforded to us by the Series X consoles and Series S consoles was to improve our terrain fidelity, in particular our road variety and variation, and the quality of our terrain and blending at the edges of the roads. So we updated our previous mega texture system, which was mainly CPU based, to a GPU based system. So this system works by combining multiple texture layers on the GPU into a single texture that can then be read very efficiently when we're rendering the road and terrain. And one of the reasons for moving that system to the GPU was to utilize the higher GPU performance of those consoles. And it also allowed us to scale the quality of that GPU rendering. So we have extra layers on the Series X and Series S consoles. We have independent ambient occlusion layers, for instance. That means we can also push the resolution of the GPU megatexture system on those consoles as well. But we still also run that on the Xbox One, and it means we get quite a consistent visual between the different platforms. One of the other things we added to the road and train system as well this time around was parallax mapping. So we now have that on by default in the Series X quality modes, and that's a system that allows us to get more of the relief of surfaces in the road and train that are undulating, and gives us a much higher quality result than we had previously.
So the SSD now allows us to do a lot higher resolution. So all of the things that we're talking about to say higher resolution, more textures, even more variation in assets would only be possible with the SSD, because you're able to load that in time, especially when you're able to drive at approximately 200 miles an hour throughout the world. You need to be able to load the content in very quickly, and these improved drives allow us to do that now.
What I find fascinating about Forza Horizon 5 is just how much work the game is doing in delivering a remarkable level of fidelity, even when you're racing around the world at 200 miles per hour. It's often worth taking a break and examining the environments via photo mode to see just how intricate the level detail is. It stands up to the kind of scrutiny we'd give to a much slower paced action game where you can actually linger on the details. Extra tech is deployed on the higher end platforms to ramp up the detail still further.
So one of the things that we added to our Series X quality mode this time around was cone stack mapping. So that's a technique that runs in the shader on a surface, and it uses a pre-computed visibility texture which calculates the visibility angle of surfaces within an undulating surface on the GPU. And given the power of the GPU on the Series X, it means we can calculate that for multiple surfaces in the world. We also run an internal shadow pass on that as well. So when we're calculating the height offsets, we also calculate correct shadowing, and that picks up details that are too fine for the shadow maps to pick up on. And one of the other features that we added as well for the high-end quality modes was a feature called close contact shadows. So this is an improvement to our shadow system, and it augments our shadow maps to give you shadows from very fine details in the environment, particularly for fine details from things like alpha-tested foliage, which normally shadow maps struggle with in terms of resolution. So close contact shadows is a technique that uses the depth information in the scene to trace rays from the surface to the light source and work out where you've got occlusion. And we use it to get rid of things like shadow biasing artifacts, where previously you might have had gaps in very fine detailed objects at their base, where the shadow map might miss that shadow information. And the close contact shadows gives you that information back in and gives you a much higher quality result.
And the more target platforms that enter the mix, the more onerous the implications are in terms of the tools needed to create the game.
Scalability was a big factor for us in creating the game this time around, particularly as we had to scale from Gen 8 systems from the Xbox One all the way up to Series X and high-end PC. And that meant that from the ground up, we had to make sure that our art processes, our tools processes, our performance checking would scale across that range of machines. And we built it into the engine from a very early point. We've invested heavily in our tooling to allow that scalability to not impact the artist's workflows. So we added a procedural world system that allows us to create content for the game that scales across all of those systems, and we can tune the values without the artist having to manually place and add those objects to the world. On the rendering side as well, it meant that we invested in our performance testing. So we had a lot of systems to make sure that all of the different combinations and platforms would run at our fixed target frame rate. And we had to run that data every night. We capture all that data on the server. And it means that we also had to have tools to analyze that data and make sure we didn't have any regressions across all of the different platforms.
From a content point of view, it's the first time that we've authored custom meshes for different platforms. So the Xbox Series X and S has a whole new LOD, but we're also able to author higher resolution materials and higher resolution textures. And we were able to swap in and out shader features for these higher end platforms. But it means that we're always delivering the best performance and the best experience that we can for our players across all of the ranges due to the scalability that we're able to do now.
Scalability also means that delivering rock-solid performance becomes a lot more difficult, obviously, as there's more hardware to service. The first two Forza Horizon titles shipped on just one target platform. PC and Xbox One X made the task more challenging for Forza Horizon 3 and 4. Now, two more consoles with radically different capabilities added to the logistics of creating the latest game.
It's also a very important part of the game for us to aim for that really smooth, solid frame rate across all of the different versions that we produce. And we've kept that philosophy even on the Gen 8 versions on the Durango. We don't let down that solid 30 FPS experience, and we take that through up to the higher end consoles in both the 60 and 30 FPS modes. We really aim for that smooth frame rate experience. To do that, we have a number of different systems in place, and it requires collaboration between a lot of the different groups. So starting at the art side in terms of specification of the objects and budgeting of those objects, even in pre-production, moving through the toolchain, shader production, and then onto the rendering systems as well, and making sure that they're as optimal as they can be for each platform. And one of the ways that we make sure we hit that frame rate target is to invest in our toolchain for checking the performance of the game in all the different modes. So we have obviously a number of different consoles and PC flavors that we're running on, but we also have different combinations of race type, weather type, seasons, locations in the open world as well. So what we do is we have a suite of servers that run performance data for all of those combinations. Normally we run them once a night overnight, and they produce data that we analyze in specific tool sets to make sure that we're hitting our budget targets for all of the different components of the scene, including the track, the car rendering, the environment, the post-process, and so on. And those tools allow us to check that all of that data is coming in at the frame rate target. If we find that there are areas that are below target during development, it allows us to talk to the artists or the tech artists or the rendering team to work out where we need to focus our optimization efforts. And we also use that data to inform us about the level of DRS engagement in the game as well. So even though we use DRS, we want to use this as a fallback for the player rather than having it engaging all the time. So we have strict DRS budgets that we also check and make sure that in the platforms and modes where we're using that DRS, it's also engaging at the right amount. The other benefit of the system as well is it allows us to capture that data nightly, so we can check if we've had any reduction in performance due to changes we've made to shaders or environment. We can go back and find out if we've made any changes that we want to optimize in future. And also it allows us to track the quality of the game as well. This system's also take automated screenshots every night, which we can check and make sure that things like our lighting quality and our environment quality are also not regressing and getting worse.
My time at the Playground studio ended with a teaser of what's to come in Forza Horizon 5, the idea that the world itself is not set in stone, that it can change. Here's a hint at the kind of things we should expect and the technology Playground has put in place to make it happen.
In Forza Horizon 4, obviously the season changed every week, but let's say week 1 was spring. That means week 5 is also spring, and those two springs would be the same. We weren't able to add even a new speed trap. The base world would be pretty much identical. We added a load of new gameplay content, so we had new championships. We always give you new challenges and things to do. There was really good reasons to keep playing Horizon 4, and a lot of people did. All of that stuff is still true, but we are now able to go and evolve the world, so we can add new speed traps, new races, new collectibles. We can redress the world for a real-world holiday, so you'll see the world get redressed in different ways.
We have built with evolving world in mind, knowing that we want to support Forza Horizon 5 into the future. So we have built it in a way that we can update the world as we continue to add more content to the world, and also maybe remove content or change content. And as we move forward, there will be more on this in the future.